In 1995, in a factory on the edge of Huntingdon, Cambridgeshire, a set of precision machines was taken apart, crated, and sent to Germany. The machines had been building the same loudspeaker since 1957. Not a revised version, not a reissued version. The same loudspeaker. For 38 years, those machines had stretched ultra-thin mylar film between perforated metal panels, aligned components to tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter, and produced something that the engineers at the BBC had trusted for decades as their reference for what recorded sound was actually supposed to sound like. The company that owned those machines had just been acquired. The new owners had plans for the name. The machines, it turned out, were going to Germany. Not because the loudspeaker had failed, not because demand had collapsed. The previous year, the same company had been awarded recognition at the highest level the British state offered to a manufacturer. 17 years before that, it had received the Queen's Award for Technological Achievement, the only time that award had ever been given to a hi-fi manufacturer in British history. The machines left anyway. And that is where the real story of Quad begins. Not in the boardroom where the sale was agreed, not in the shipping container heading for Shenzhen, but in the question that neither transaction could answer: what does it mean when a country abandons the very standard it invented? If you care about the stories behind the sounds, the people who built them, the companies that lost them, and the Britain that let them go subscribe to Forgotten Instruments UK, there are more stories where this one came from. Peter James Walker was born in 1916 and educated at Oundle, a public school in Northamptonshire with a tradition in engineering and the sciences. He worked for EMI and then GEC, two of the largest electrical manufacturers in Britain, before arriving at a conclusion that was less romantic than it was arithmetical. An amplifier sold for £30. The components inside it cost £5. The gap between those two numbers was in Walker's assessment an opportunity. In 1936, in London, he founded a company he called high-fidelity Sound Systems, changed the name to the Acoustical Manufacturing Company in the same year, and began building amplifiers. He was 20 years old. Britain in 1936 had no domestic hi-fi industry in any meaningful sense. The term itself had not yet been coined. What existed were public address systems, wireless sets, and the occasional adapted component pressed into domestic service by enthusiasts who wanted something better than the family radiogram and were prepared to wire it themselves. If a British musician or listener in 1936 wanted equipment designed specifically for the accurate reproduction of recorded music at home, there was nowhere in Britain to buy it. That gap between what serious listeners wanted and what the market provided was the space Walker had decided to occupy. The Second World War interrupted everything. The Luftwaffe settled the question of Walker's London premises in the direct way that the Luftwaffe settled most questions. The factory was bombed. In 1941, Walker moved the company to Huntingdon, Cambridgeshire, not a city of music or manufacture, not a place with any particular industrial heritage in audio, but a market town 40 miles north of London that happened to be intact. It was a practical decision. It would become a permanent one. Huntingdon would remain the address of Quad engineering for the rest of the century and beyond. During the war, the work was public address equipment amplifiers for announcements, for communications, for the management of large crowds in circumstances that did not allow for technical failure. It was unglamorous work. It was also work that required precision reliability and the kind of engineering discipline that does not accommodate approximation. Walker applied the same standards to wartime PA systems that he would later apply to domestic hi-fi. The habit of exactness once formed does not easily permit exceptions. After the war, the market shifted. Returning servicemen with some money and some leisure time wanted to listen to music at home. Records were improving. Broadcast quality was improving. The equipment available to play them through was not keeping pace. Walker turned his attention to that problem. In 1948, the company released its first domestic amplifier, the QA-12, a design that drew directly on Walker's wartime work and exceeded in measurable terms everything else available at the same price in the British market. Within a year, the BBC had taken notice. The engineers responsible for broadcast monitoring, the people whose professional purpose was to know with certainty what recorded sound was supposed to sound like, adopted the QA-12 for studio use. It was not a marketing endorsement. It was a technical verdict. The name Quad followed. Quality Unit Amplifier Domestic. Not a brand identity fashioned by a marketing department, an acronym coined by an engineer to describe with clinical accuracy what the product was and what it was for. In a trade where superlatives were the common currency of advertising, Walker had chosen a name that made a measurable claim. If the engineers paid to know good sound from bad had chosen Quad, what more was there left to prove? As it turned out, quite a lot. In 1953, the year Queen Elizabeth II was crowned at Westminster Abbey, and Edmund Hillary stood on the summit of Everest. Peter Walker released the Quad 2 power amplifier. The timing was coincidental. The significance was not. The Quad 2 was a valve amplifier, a device that used thermionic valves, glass tubes containing heated filaments in a vacuum, to amplify the electrical signal from a gramophone pickup or a radio tuner into something large enough to drive a loudspeaker. Every serious amplifier of the period used valves. What distinguished the Quad 2 was not the technology it used, but the way Walker had arranged it. The critical innovation was in the output stage, the final circuit through which the amplified signal passes before reaching the loudspeaker. Walker configured his output valves a pair of Marconi Osram KT66S in a cathode-coupled arrangement that mimicked the behavior of triode valves while retaining the efficiency of pentodes. The distinction matters. In practical terms, triodes produce a more linear, lower distortion signal, but require large, expensive transformers. Pentodes are more efficient, but introduce harmonic distortion that trained ears find objectionable. Walker's cathode-coupled circuit achieved triode-quality distortion figures with pentode efficiency. It was an elegant solution to a problem that had occupied amplifier designers for years, and it required no exotic components, no unusual materials, no manufacturing process unavailable to a Huntingdon workshop in 1953. The result was a 15-watt monoblock amplifier, a single unit producing audio for one channel that looked to anyone accustomed to the larger, more imposing equipment of the period surprisingly modest. The Quad 2 was compact, unassuming, and designed to be hidden inside a cabinet, alongside a tuner and a turntable, rather than displayed as an object of pride. Walker had no interest in appearance as a selling point. He had a considerable interest in the fact that 15 watts cleanly amplified was sufficient for any domestic listening environment in which a reasonable person might actually sit and listen to music. That last point provoked argument. 15 watts was considered by many in the trade inadequate. Rival manufacturers were producing 30, 40, 50 watts. Walker's response was characteristic. He pointed to the distortion figures. High wattage achieved through compromised circuit design produced an amplifier that measured impressively on a specification sheet and sounded to ears trained on live music subtly wrong. Walker was not interested in specification sheets. He was interested in whether the sound coming out of the loudspeaker was an accurate representation of the sound that had gone into the microphone. On that measure, the Quad 2 had few equals in Britain at any price. The BBC agreed. The same engineers who had adopted the QA-12 recognized the Quad 2 as a refinement of the same principle, the closest approach in measurable and audible terms to the original sound. That phrase, the closest approach to the original sound, had by now become the company's stated purpose, printed in its literature, cited in its advertisements in Wireless World and Hi-Fi News. It was in the context of British audio advertising an unusual form of confidence. Most manufacturers promised excellence in general terms. Walker had promised a specific thing: fidelity. Not warmth, not power, not presence fidelity. The difference between what went in and what came out minimized to the point where the difference became inaudible. Between 1953 and 1970, more than 90,000 Quad 2 amplifiers were manufactured in Huntingdon. That figure for a high-fidelity monoblock amplifier produced by a single British company in a Cambridgeshire market town is not a sales statistic. It is a statement about what the British listening public and a significant portion of the professional audio community had decided they trusted the Quad 2 remained in production alongside its solid-state successor, the 303. Until 1970, 17 years after its introduction, at a time when the consumer electronics industry was measuring product life cycles in months, not decades. Walker had not set out to build a classic. He had set out to build something that worked. The two things in this instance turned out to be the same. What kind of loudspeaker stays in unaltered production for 28 years? Not because no better design exists, but because none has yet been needed. The question is not rhetorical. It has a specific answer, and that answer is housed in the physics of what Peter Walker built in Huntingdon in 1957. Every loudspeaker that existed before the quad electrostatic loudspeaker worked on the same fundamental principle. A cone of paper or card was attached to a coil of wire suspended in a magnetic field. When electrical current passed through the coil, the magnetic interaction pushed and pulled the cone back and forth, and that movement displaced air, and that displaced air was sound. The system had been in use in various forms since the 1920s. It worked. It also introduced at every stage of the process distortions, small inaccuracies in the relationship between the electrical signal going in and the acoustic signal coming out. The cone had mass. Mass resisted acceleration. Resistance to acceleration meant that the loudspeaker's response to rapid changes in the signal, the attack of a piano note, the transient of a snare drum, the consonant at the beginning of a sung word, was always slightly late, always slightly blurred, always slightly wrong. Walker had been thinking about an alternative since approximately 1945. The principle he was working toward was electrostatic transduction. Instead of moving a heavy cone with a magnetic coil, use electrical charge to move an extremely thin, extremely light membrane directly. No coil, no magnet, no cone. A sheet of mylar film, a plastic material so thin that light passes through it, stretched under precise tension between two perforated metal panels called stators. A high-voltage electrical bias applied to the membrane. The audio signal stepped up in voltage by a transformer applied to the stators. The varying electrical field between the stators and the membrane causes the membrane to move, and that movement is sound. The membrane in the ESL 57 weighed almost nothing. Its resistance to acceleration was correspondingly almost nothing. The attack of a piano note arrived at the listener's ear at the correct moment in its correct shape, without the rounding that cone loudspeakers imposed on transient information. The human voice, particularly in its upper frequencies, in the consonants that carry intelligibility, reproduced with a clarity that listeners in 1957 had not previously heard from any loudspeaker at any price. BBC engineers whose professional credibility rested on their ability to make accurate judgments about recorded sound adopted the ESL 57 as a reference monitor. When those engineers sat in front of a pair of ESL 57s to evaluate whether a recording made at Abbey Road or a broadcast originating from Broadcasting House was meeting the standards the BBC had set for itself. They were making that judgment through Walker's Mylar film, through his perforated stators, through the transformer he had wound in Huntingdon. The BBC was using the ESL 57 not as a preference, but as a definition. This is what accurate sound reproduction looks like. This is the standard against which other things are measured. That endorsement was not purchased. It was not negotiated. It arrived because the engineers responsible for making the judgment concluded on the basis of listening that the ESL 57 was the most accurate transducer available to them. In a professional environment where accuracy was the only currency that mattered, that conclusion was the equivalent of a government certificate, except that it carried more weight, because the people who issued it understood what they were certifying. The ESL 57 remained in production, its fundamental design unchanged from 1957 until 1985. Approximately 54,000 pairs were manufactured during that run. The figure is modest by the standards of mass-market consumer electronics. It is extraordinary by the standards of a precision instrument manufactured to tolerances that could not be achieved by an automated production line because each membrane had to be tensioned by hand. Each stator assembly had to be aligned by eye and by instrument. Each completed panel had to be tested individually before it left the Huntingdon factory. The ESL 57 was not a product that could be scaled. It was a product that could be made well or made badly, and Walker had no interest in the second option. Meanwhile, in 1967, the company made a decision that divided the hi-fi community with a precision the ESL 57 would have approved of. Walker discontinued the Quad II and replaced it with the 33 preamplifier and 303 power amplifier, the company's first transistor designs for the domestic market. Transistors had been replacing valves in consumer electronics for a decade. Most of the amplifiers produced during the transition sounded, in the opinion of serious listeners, worse than the valve designs they replaced. Early transistor amplifiers introduced a specific form of distortion, crossover distortion, an artifact of the point at which the circuit transitions between its positive and negative operating cycles that produced an audible harshness on certain types of musical material, particularly sustained notes and vocals. Walker's approach to the problem was again characteristically methodical. The 303 used a circuit topology he called 333 transistors, operating in a specific configuration at the output stage that addressed the thermal instability problems common to early transistor designs and reduced crossover distortion to levels that the company's own listening tests could not reliably distinguish from zero. The 33 preamplifier that accompanied it was spare functional and designed to occupy the minimum possible space in a domestic setting, 10¼ inches wide, 6 inches deep, intended to sit on a shelf rather than dominate a room. The Design Council awarded the 33 300/3 combination its highest recognition in 1969. The Quad 33 subsequently entered the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, not as a curiosity, not as a period artifact, but as an example of industrial design that solved its problem with such economy of means that the solution became in itself a kind of statement. Between 1967 and 1982, 120,000 units of the Quad 33 were manufactured. The 303 power amplifier produced alongside it until 1985 reached 94,000 units. These were not niche figures. These were the numbers of a company that had moved from being the reference standard for a small community of serious listeners to being the reference standard for a substantial portion of the British hi-fi market, and increasingly for professional audio installations on both sides of the Atlantic. The BBC was using quad amplifiers in its studios. Recording engineers were using quad amplifiers at home to check their work against something they trusted. The name on the front panel had become for a specific and significant group of people a synonym for the thing it claimed to be the closest approach to the original sound. Walker was in his early 50s. He was not finished. In December 1975, Peter Walker published a technical paper in Wireless World magazine. The title was functional. The prose was precise, and the idea contained within it was, by the standards of power amplifier design, genuinely original. The problem Walker had set himself was one that had occupied audio engineers since the transition to transistor amplification. High-powered transistor amplifiers were inherently difficult to make with low distortion. The physics of the output stage, the circuit that actually delivers current to the loudspeaker, imposed a trade-off. A low-power Class A design could achieve very low distortion, but could not produce the output levels that increasingly inefficient loudspeakers demanded. A high-power Class B or Class AB design could produce the required output, but introduced distortion that Walker and the listeners he designed for found unacceptable. Every amplifier manufacturer in the world was managing this trade-off. Walker had decided to dissolve it. His solution was current dumping. The principle was this: use two amplifiers simultaneously operating in parallel. The first small, low-powered Class A produces an output of exceptional accuracy and negligible distortion. The second, large, high-powered Class AB produces an output of adequate accuracy and some distortion. Walker designed a bridge circuit that continuously compared the output of the high-powered stage with the output of the low-powered stage, derived the error, the difference between what the high-powered stage was producing and what the low-powered stage was producing, and injected a correction signal back into the audio path to cancel the distortion of the high-powered stage in real time. The result was an amplifier that produced 100 watts per channel, with distortion figures characteristic of a Class A design running at a fraction of that power. The Quad 405, which embodied this principle, was released in 1975. It looked like a piece of professional equipment, which is largely what it was: vertical cooling fins running across the front panel, a deliberately industrial aesthetic that made no concession to the decorative expectations of the domestic hi-fi market. It connected to loudspeakers via a 5-pin DIN connector at a time when most of the industry had standardized on binding posts. Walker had designed it to work optimally with his own loudspeakers at his own specified impedances in his own system context, and he saw no reason to change the connection method because the rest of the industry had chosen differently. In 1978, the Queen's Award for Technological Achievement was presented to Quad Electroacoustics. It was the only time that award had been given to a hi-fi manufacturer. Not the only time it had been given to a small British engineering company from a market town in Cambridgeshire, the only time in the entire history of the award that any company making audio equipment for domestic or professional use had been deemed to have made a contribution to British technology significant enough to merit the recognition. The citation acknowledged the current dumping circuit. Walker received the award with the same absence of ceremony that characterized most of his public statements on the subject of his own work. Between 1975 and 1982, 64,000 units of the original Quad 405 were manufactured. The revised 405, two produced from 1982 to 1993, reached 100,000 units, the highest production run of any amplifier in the company's history. BBC Studios, which had been using Quad products since the QA-12 of the late 1940s, installed the 405 in monitoring and production roles. Recording engineers who had grown up trusting Quad equipment continued to trust it in its new form. The company that had begun as a one-man operation in a London workshop in 1936 relocated to a Cambridgeshire market town by a German bomb in 1941, and spent 40 years building a reputation on the single claim that its products sounded more like real music than anything else available. That company was in the late 1970s, at the precise peak of its credibility. In 1981, Walker returned to the loudspeaker. The ESL 57 had been in production for 24 years. Its fundamental design had not changed. What had changed was the recorded music that listeners were playing through it, music with greater dynamic range, wider frequency content, and higher peak levels than the recordings of 1957 had been engineered to contain. The ESL 57's power handling was by the standards of 1981 limited. Its sweet spot, the precise listening position at which its directional characteristics produced accurate stereo imaging, was narrow. Walker had spent years working on a design that addressed both limitations without abandoning the core principle of the electrostatic transducer. The ESL 63 used concentric annular electrodes rings of electrically active material arranged around a central point fed by sequential delay lines that introduced tiny, precisely calculated time differences between the signal reaching the inner and outer rings. The effect was to make the panel radiate sound in a spherical wavefront originating from a single point, a point source, rather than from the entire panel surface simultaneously. A true point source in acoustic theory produces a sound field that expands in all directions equally without the directional narrowing that had characterized the ESL 57. Walker called the concept Fred Full-Range Electrostatic Dipole. The first year's production of the ESL 63 sold out within 2 months of its announcement. The design received international recognition from every publication in the specialist hi-fi press that assessed it. It became, as the ESL 57 had been before it, the reference loudspeaker, the object against which other objects were measured, not because it was the most expensive, not because it was the most powerful, but because it did what it claimed to do with a consistency and an accuracy that its competitors had not matched. Peter Walker retired from day-to-day management of the company in the late 1980s. He had built over 50 years an organization that had been acknowledged by the BBC, by the Design Council, by the Museum of Modern Art, and by the Crown, as having contributed something of lasting value to British engineering and British culture. He had done it from the factory in a market town with a workforce that built things by hand, to tolerances that no automated production line had yet been persuaded to match. He had done it without venture capital, without a marketing department in any meaningful sense, without a product line that extended beyond what the company's engineering conscience could justify. He handed management to his son Ross Walker and stepped back. He did not, as far as the available record shows, take any steps to protect the company he had built from what was coming next. The 1990s were not kind to British hi-fi. The decade opened with a market that had fractured along lines that the previous generation of British manufacturers had not anticipated and were not positioned to manage. At the lower end, the compact disc had completed its displacement of vinyl as the dominant domestic format, and with it had come a generation of Japanese and Far Eastern players' receivers and integrated amplifiers that offered adequate sound quality at prices that British manufacturers, with their higher labor costs and smaller production volumes, could not match without compromising the engineering standards that justified their existence. At the upper end, a new category of boutique amplifier makers, some British, many European, a growing number from the United States, had begun to occupy the space that Quad had defined, offering their own versions of the closest approach to the original sound, at prices that positioned them as objects of aspiration rather than tools of precision. Quad sat between these forces with a product range that had not fundamentally changed in its engineering philosophy since 1936, and a brand identity that was simultaneously its greatest asset and its most significant commercial liability. The name meant something meant it specifically meant it to a defined community of listeners and professionals whose trust had been earned over decades. But the name was attached to products that were priced above the mass market and below the luxury tier in a space that the market of the early 1990s was making increasingly difficult to inhabit. Ross Walker had managed the company through the late 1980s with the same engineering values his father had established. The 66 series, a preamplifier and power amplifier combination, released in the mid-1980s, updated the 405 topology with more refined ergonomics and greater power output. The 77 series, which arrived in 1994, introduced a fully integrated system approach amplifier CD player and tuner linked by a proprietary communication protocol called Quad Link, operated by a single remote control. The 77 integrated amplifier won the European Amplifier of the Year award in 1996. It used a pure Class B output circuit designed by Danish engineer Jan Ertner that solved the crossover distortion problem by a different mathematical route from Walker's current, dumping a sign that the company's engineering culture remained alive and inventive, even as the commercial environment tightened around it. But the accounts told a different story. The hi-fi market of the mid-1990s rewarded scale brand visibility and distribution reach, none of which Quad possessed in the quantities the market now demanded. The Huntingdon factory, which had been producing instruments of precision since 1941, was operating in an economic environment that valued precision less than it valued price. The gap between what it cost to build a quad amplifier in Cambridgeshire and what a competing product cost to assemble in East Asia had become, by 1995, a gap that no engineering argument could close. In 1995, Verity Group plc acquired Quad Electroacoustics. Verity already owned Wharfedale and Mission 2 British speaker brands that had undergone their own transitions from independent manufacturers to components of a larger portfolio. The logic of the acquisition was the logic of consolidation. Combine the administration, reduce the overhead leverage, the brand names across a rationalized production base. The production base Verity had in mind was in Shenzhen, China. Was the name Quad worth anything if the hands that had built Quad were no longer in Huntingdon? The question did not appear to have been part of the deliberation. In the years following the acquisition, manufacturing transferred to Shenzhen. The Huntingdon site retained design and service functions, a meaningful preservation, as it would turn out, but not the preservation of the thing that had defined the company's identity for nearly 6 decades. What had defined that identity was not the name on the front panel. It was the tolerance stack of a hand-assembled electrostatic panel. It was the measurement routine applied to every completed amplifier before it left the building. It was the culture of exactness that Walker had carried from his wartime PA work into his post-war hi-fi work and had never permitted to be diluted. That culture required people, specific people with specific skills in a specific place working to a specific standard. When the production moved, the people did not move with it. Some retired. Some found other work. The skills they carried, the particular knowledge of how a mylar membrane behaves under tension, of the correct feel of a correctly wound transformer, of the audible difference between an ESL panel that meets specification and one that nearly meets specification, those skills dispersed into the Huntingdon air and were not recoverable by a purchase order. The ESL 57 had already ceased UK production. By this point, having officially concluded its run in 1985, before demand persuaded the company to continue manufacturing until 1995. When the Verity acquisition formalized the transfer of production to Shenzhen, the machinery that had built the ESL 57 was sold to Quad's German distributor, Quad Musikwiedergabe. The Germans had asked for it specifically. They understood what they were buying. The machinery was not valuable as scrap metal. It was valuable as the only means by which a specific object, the ESL 57 loudspeaker unchanged in fundamental design since 1957, could continue to be made correctly. In September 1997, Verity Group sold Quad and Wharfedale to the International Audio Group, a Chinese company managed by Bernard and Michael Chang, headquartered in Shenzhen. Verity needed capital for its own development projects. Quad was sold to raise it. Peter Walker was 81 years old. He had founded the company 61 years earlier with the proceeds of a single amplifier sale and a conviction that the gap between the cost of components and the price of finished equipment represented an engineering opportunity. He had spent those 61 years closing a different gap, the gap between what recorded music sounded like and what live music sounded like, with a rigor and a consistency that the British engineering establishment had twice formally acknowledged. He did not give interviews about the sale. On the 10th of December 2003, Peter James Walker died at the age of 87. In the same year, the International Audio Group commissioned Ken Kessler, a veteran British audio writer who had known Walker and had documented Quad's history across decades of journalism, to write a book about the company. The book was titled Quad: The Closest Approach. IAG published it. The phrase on the cover had been Walker's since the 1940s. The name was still there. The factory was in China. The machines were in Germany. The man was gone. And the question that had been there since 1995 remained precise and unanswered, like a signal with no loudspeaker to play it through. The International Audio Group did not dismantle Quad. That distinction matters, and it is worth stating plainly before anything else is said about what followed. IAG retained the design and engineering function in Huntingdon. The service department, the team responsible for repairing and restoring Quad equipment, some of it decades old, all of it built to a standard that assumed it would be worth repairing, continued to operate from the same Cambridgeshire address where Peter Walker had moved the company in 1941. New products continued to be developed with genuine engineering input from people who understood what the name on the front panel was supposed to mean. The ESL line continued to evolve. The ESL 988 and ESL 989. The ESL 2000, 805, and ESL 2905, the ESL 2000, 812, and ESL 2912, each a refinement of the electrostatic principle that Walker had realized in 1957, each carrying forward the claim that a membrane lighter than air driven by an electrical field, rather than a mechanical coil, remains the most accurate means yet devised of converting an electrical signal into acoustic pressure. Whether any of this constitutes a survival or a continuation is a question that the secondary market has already answered with the blunt clarity that markets apply to questions that sentiment tends to complicate. A pair of original Quad 2 monoblock amplifiers, the 15-watt KT66 designs, that Walker introduced in 1953 and produced until 1970 in unmodified original condition, will sell today for approaching £2,000. Modified examples with replaced components or altered circuit values attract considerably less. The market has formed a specific opinion about what the original represents and what any departure from it costs. A pair of ESL 57 loudspeakers in working condition, the panels still holding charge, the mylar membranes intact and correctly tensioned, will change hands on the specialist market for figures that reflect not nostalgia, but function. These are instruments that working engineers and serious listeners still buy with the intention of using them, not displaying them. The Quad 405. The amplifier that earned the Queen's Award in 1978 appears regularly on the secondary market at prices that reflect its continued relevance as a professional tool. Audio engineers who encountered it in BBC studios during the 1980s acquire examples for their own use. There is a category of recording that a Quad 405 driving a pair of ESL 57S or ESL 63XA resolves with a specificity, a spatial accuracy, a transient precision that contemporary alternatives, whatever their measurements suggest, do not consistently replicate for ears trained on what the original sounds like. And then there is Germany. When Quad Musikwiedergabe acquired the ESL 57 production machinery from Huntingdon in 1995, they did not do so as an act of preservation. They did so because they had customers who wanted ESL 57 loudspeakers, and no other manufacturer in the world was in a position to supply them. The machinery was the means of production. The means of production in this specific case was inseparable from the product because the ESL 57 is not an object that can be made by a different method and remain the same object. The tooling that tensions the mylar membrane, the jigs that align the stator assemblies, the test equipment calibrated to Walker's original specifications, these are not interchangeable with general-purpose audio manufacturing equipment. They are specific to this loudspeaker, as the loudspeaker is specific to them. Quad Musikwiedergabe continue to manufacture the ESL 57 in Germany to this day. A new pair costs at current European pricing approximately €5,690. The waiting list is not short. The customers are not exclusively German. They come from Britain, from Japan, from the United States, from every country where serious listeners have concluded that nothing produced since 1957 has yet superseded what Walker built in Huntingdon. The machines left England in 1995. The demand for what those machines produce has not. And if the machines are still running just not in England, what exactly did Britain lose? The answer is not the object. The object is still available. The answer is not the design. The design is documented, patented, and fully understood by the engineers at IAG, who continue to develop its descendants. The answer is not even the sound, precisely because the sound can still be heard by anyone willing to spend what a working pair of ESL 57S now costs on the secondary market, or what a new pair from Germany now costs at retail. What Britain lost in 1995 was the location of the standard for 59 years, from 1936 to 1995. The place where British engineering decided what accurate sound reproduction looked like was a factory in Huntingdon, Cambridgeshire. The judgments made in that factory about distortion, about frequency response, about the correct tension of a mylar membrane were the judgments that the BBC trusted, that the Design Council recognized, that the Queen's Award certified. Those judgments were made by British people in a British place with British equipment for a British institution. When the production moved, the location of the standard moved with it. The standard itself, the idea that the correct measure of an audio product is how closely it approaches the sound of live music, and that this closeness is measurable and should be measured, that idea remains. But it is no longer anchored to a place. The Huntingdon Service Department still repairs ESL 57S. Units built in the 1960s arrive from across the world, are assessed against Walker's original specifications, are restored, where possible, to their original operating condition, and are returned to owners who regard them as instruments rather than antiques. The service team work from documentation that Walker's engineers produced, apply tolerances that Walker established, and return equipment to a standard that Walker defined. In this narrow but not trivial sense, something of the original enterprise persists in the town where it was assembled. Peter Walker played flute in the Huntingdon Philharmonic. In July 1984, the orchestra performed Elgar's The Dream of Gerontius in Ely Cathedral. And Walker was in the ensemble, a white-haired man concentrating on a complex orchestral part in a medieval building 11 miles from his factory. The recording of that performance was made on a Sony digital system. Walker listened to it afterwards at his home through Quad equipment. The man who had spent 40 years trying to make recorded music sound like live music sat in his own house and listened to a recording of himself playing live music through the equipment he had built to make that distinction as small as possible. It is the most complete sentence in the Quad story. The engineer and his instrument and his standard briefly indistinguishable from one another. He died in December 2003. In the catalogue of the Science Museum in London, the Quad Electroacoustics Company is listed as a manufacturer of objects of historical and technical significance. The ESL 57 is in the collection. So, in a different sense, is the 33 preamplifier in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, 4,500 miles from the Huntingdon workshop, where Walker designed it to be mounted inside a cabinet and hidden from view. Objects have a way of outlasting the conditions that produced them. The ESL 57 is still in production in Germany. The Quad 2 still sells for close to £2,000 in original condition. The 405 is still used in professional studios. The service department in Huntingdon still answers the telephone. And somewhere in a listening room, in the English suburbs Huntingdon perhaps, or Cambridge or any of the towns within reach of the Cambridgeshire flat that Walker called home for 6 decades, a pair of ESL 57 panels is still holding charge, still tensioning its mylar membrane to the specification that Walker settled on before most of its current owners were born, still converting an electrical signal into acoustic pressure with the particular accuracy that made BBC engineers stop what they were doing and listen the first time they heard it in a way they had not listened to a loudspeaker before. The name on the back panel reads, The Acoustical Manufacturing Company Limited, Huntingdon, England. The company changed its name 40 years ago. The factory that made this panel is no longer making panels. The man who designed it died in 2003. The panel is still working. That is what 59 years of British engineering precision looks like in the only form it now takes an object in a room doing exactly what it was made to do, in exactly the way it was made to do it, long after the place that made it has moved on to other things. If you have found this story worth an hour of your time, consider subscribing to Forgotten Instruments UK. Every episode is another name, another factory, another sound that Britain made and the world still remembers. The next one is already waiting. See you in the next one.